led by UC Davis alum Rachel Carpenter. And so the task force released their report of findings recommending changes to the approach for speed limit setting in 2020. And basically everything I'm going to talk about today is based on recommendations for this report. So it was a really forward-looking report that had a number of recommendations in different areas, including engineering, education, enforcement, the 3 E's, which we don't love, but a really good report. And out of that, the soonest, biggest thing we saw was AB 43 and AB 1938 were bills that created new flexibility to reduce speed limits in the state. So still working within this framework of the 85th percentile approach, but allowing some new flexibility. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. As their framework for achieving their Vision Zero goal in 2022. So that's our context for the work that's been going on. So you don't need to read this whole table, but AB 43 and AB 1938 started to move us away from relying just on the 85th percentile approach. So examples are establishing a prima facie speed limit for business activity district. So that's a new type of speed limit. It could be, I think, as low as 20 miles per hour through business districts, and it does not require an engineering and traffic survey, which is a big financial burden for many jurisdictions. Additionally, it allowed the designation of safety corridors, which you might know more familiarly as high injury networks, to lower speed limits there. It allowed cities to round their speeds down to the nearest 5 miles per hour, even if it was over that 2.5 threshold. So overall, this new flexibility, if an engineering traffic survey was required, allowed that to be, the speed limit to be set up to, I think, 13.5 miles per hour below the 85th percentile. It'll also allowed extension of the validity period for engineering and traffic surveys. So these are all ways to make it easier for cities to enforce their speed limits. And then the table is showing for these different measures, which applied on locally controlled roads and which applied on state controlled roads. And most of them do not apply on the state highway system, which is a challenge because the state highway system does include some urban arterials, which are some of the most prominent high injury network locations. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my projects related to this. So, this is not research work. This was some education and engagement work, not so much on changing driver behavior, but we developed some accessible guidance for implementing the changes under AB 43 and AB 1938. With the goal of helping cities to take advantage of these new flexibilities. And the way this was implemented or funded was the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, which is a plan that's required under the Highway Safety Improvement Program. So it's a federal requirement to have these plans, and it's basically a plan for the state to reduce fatalities and serious injuries, and they focus on the crashes that are most associated with those levels of injury. And so in California, we have challenge areas related to these high severity types of crashes. And so one of those is pedestrian, and those challenge areas had action items in their plan that addressed creating this guidance and helping to helping cities to implement these changes. So what is T3? So it took me a while to figure this out because the name of the project was on the contract was literally Safe Speeds T3. So we developed a Safe Speeds toolkit for decision maker and community stakeholders. So you can find that on SafeTREC's website. And one of the things we're really proud of from this is this flow chart for the decision for what speeds can be. So whether you're going to have a prima facie speed limit, or if you do an engineering and traffic survey, what are the different reductions that you can apply to achieve a speed that's going to be compliant with state law. And then we conducted trainings of the toolkit. So we have a presentation online, and then we did pilot technical assistance with 2 cities. So we tested out our training presentation on these 2 cities, and then we did the recorded. Our goal for the cities that we worked with, we figured larger cities like LA and San Francisco, they have the capability, they have the staff on board to figure this stuff out on their own. Very small cities, we were a little worried about them having the capacity to participate and implement the changes that we identified for them. And so we focused on identifying sort of mid-sized cities that had the institutional capacity, but maybe not the resources to figure this all out on their own. So we try not to tell you this. City and an inland empire city, and that's a few stats about those. So we went out to each of these cities. We did some research beforehand, collecting crash data, understanding where there's speed-related crashes were, understanding what the functional classifications were of the streets in the area. So making sure that like local roads, they knew that those could be 25 miles per hour. Looking at their history of engineering and traffic surveys, their local road safety plans, and potential. We asked them to bring an engineer, a planner, and a law enforcement representative. And it was actually really, really effective having the law enforcement folks, because they're the ones who actually respond to the crashes. And, you know, they're enforcing speed limits when they can. So those are the sort of on the ground folks that have really useful knowledge for these efforts. So in the morning we did training with Q&A and decided on which corridors we were going to go check out. And then we did a field visit. So drove around and stopped and got out and looked at what the pedestrian experience was like, and talked about like locations where the surveys could be conducted to maximize the potential reductions in speed limits. And then afterwards, we finalized citywide and corridor specific recommendations. So I'm going to jump briefly into. And this is something that we're working on with Caltrans right now. And so Caltrans has a number of safety monitoring programs, and both proactive and reactive programs. So they're looking at locations with crash history or with attributes that suggest potential for safety concerns. And they'll identify those locations at headquarters and send the locations to the districts, and the districts will conduct a traffic safety investigation. And then if they identify shortcomings in the design, they'll make recommendations to install countermeasures. And those are generally automatically approved for funding. So one of the recommendations out of the Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force report of findings was to develop a speed-related monitoring program. And so this has we have a slightly more ambitious vision for this, because speed is not just other stakeholders in California who invest in reducing speeds. So we have a vision for this program that we could identify for Caltrans report locations that may have to do with a crash mechanism related to speed. And the outcome of that would be infrastructure countermeasures. And then working with the California Office of Traffic Safety. Are folks familiar with OTS? So they're the our state highway safety office, and they receive funds from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Safety. And if you're familiar with the Safe Systems Pyramid, those are some of the higher effort, lower efficacy things, but we have that funding, and it does have some impact. So for those efforts, we were looking more at road user attributes that might allow us to target education campaigns to those that might be most influenced to reduce their speed or might have the greatest impact. And then the CHP report would look at road conditions and the types of conditions that would be appropriate for targeted enforcement to have the greatest impact. So we're in progress on this project, and some of the data we've seen from this. So the bar on the top is showing the types of speed-related fatal and serious injury crashes on non-state highways, and maybe more interesting on the state highway locations. And so just to be sure, state highway is not necessarily just freeways. So you have urban arterials, you have expressways, you have rural highways that are, just 2 lanes, and that's what much of the mileage of the state highway system is, connecting the urban areas in California. So you'll notice that for state highways, most of these speed-related crashes are rear ends. Then for non-state highways, it's still mostly rear end, but next place you have hit object and broadside. So I would say broadside is more prominent because you have more intersections on non-state highway locations. But rear end, I have a suspicion, especially on freeway locations, might be the sort of back of queue crashes where a driver is not necessarily going over the speed limit, but they did not see the queue forming in front of them and didn't stop in time. And so this next graph shows on the state highway locations, and this is a slightly different data set that we're using here. Looking, it's unfortunate that that is blocked there.
I don't know that we have a way to fix it.
Doesn't matter too much. but you can see about 3/4 of speed-related crashes are on freeways. And particularly for Caltrans, like how do you manage speeds on a freeway? Because you're not really looking to reduce speed significantly. You can't put like vertical deflection to try to slow drivers down. That's actually pretty dangerous. So this is maybe a little misleading in terms of roadway mileage. So the freeways have up 4,400 miles within the state, but that's not lane miles. So, you know, the freeways tend to have more lanes. But this does make it tricky for how you're going to address these freeway speed related crashes. There are probably a lot of rear end crashes. So if anyone has ideas, let me know. And then for the urban and rural non-freeways, I think there's more solutions there that are feasible. So I'm not presenting any great vision because this project is a work in progress. So next I'm going to jump to our work that's maybe a little more exciting. So one of the other recommendations from the Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force was related to developing a safe system approach to setting speed limits. And it wasn't called exactly this, but I'll show the recommendation on the next slide. But we were funded for phase 1 of this work to think of a vision of what a safe system approach to setting speed limits might look like, identify the gaps between existing practice in the state and what that vision would be, and then how we can fill those gaps, and then provide a framework for future California speed limit setting guide. The Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force was to develop a speed limit setting approach that considers how a street is used and by whom, how protected non-motorized users are from vehicles. So there's that non-motorized. Sorry, inside joke for those who are at lunch. How likely it is that there will be a conflict between vehicles and other street users, and how likely it is that a collision will result in a fatal or serious injury. So if you've heard about kinetic energy management, this is looking at exposure, likelihood of a crash, and then the severity, potential severity of a crash. So you're trying to address all of those things. So we identified a number of barriers to setting safe speed limits in the state. So with the current approach, there's a costly design or study requirements. So you have to conduct your engineering and traffic surveys periodically. If you don't, and they expire, you can no longer enforce your speed limits. If you want to reduce your speed limits, you need to engineer the road down to a speed that and get the drivers to change so that you can resurvey and get that speed down. Currently, there's limited local authority to reduce speed limits, so it's set in the California Vehicle Code, mostly what the procedures are. And then there's institutional resistance to change. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about what we encountered in terms of that. And then with AB 43, those changes, I talked about how some of them applied on local roads and well, all of them applied on local roads and only some of them applied on state roads. So there's this two-tiered system that makes it difficult for cities that want to reduce speeds on their arterials that have the highest crash rates. So we did stakeholder interviews and a survey. We talked to 9 practitioners and stakeholders around the state, and we identified a couple areas of agreement, which is that these 2 bills were a step in the right direction, and that it is problematic to have this 2-tiered system. But there was an agreement from everyone on the need for reform. And what we saw is that the folks who worked for the state DOT saw less need. And our thinking on that is that if you are conducting engineering and traffic surveys on rural highways, maybe the 85th percentile approach is not the worst thing. These are locations that don't really have mixed traffic. And so drivers probably are relatively okay at determining what speeds are going to be appropriate on those facilities. But the practitioners from cities and counties, they were less taken with the 85th percentile approach. So we worked with Fair and Peers on the case study portion of this study, and they did a lot of work looking at what jurisdictions around the US have done to better align with the safe system approach on speed limit setting. I wouldn't say that there's nowhere in the US where they're fully taking this on. And part of that is requirements with complying with the MUTCD. And I think that's going to change some potentially in the coming years. But we also chose to look at some international examples of countries that have been more forward looking and progressive on safe system approach. And particularly we were interested in New Zealand. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So New Zealand's approach for speed limit setting is they have this movement in place framework. And so if you think about what we do in the US with consideration of functional classification for certain categories have prima facie speed limit potentially, and certain categories need to have engineering and traffic survey. That's really just a movement framework that they're thinking about. And what the task force recommended was considering what are the other types of users. So, what are the land uses? What is going to create different activity? And that's place. So New Zealand has this movement in place framework. And so they have categorized every street on the road system in the country. And for each of those categories, there is a defined safe and appropriate speed limit. And then they have a range of speed limits based on certain features of the road. If there's safety concerns, they may have require a lower speed limit, or if you've installed some safe system countermeasures, you could justify increasing the speed limit. And then there's additional considerations like whether there's a school nearby, or if the operational speed on the road is not aligned with the speed limit, more action should be taken. So maybe this is a little more clear about what the movement in place framework looks like. So they have their movement measure on the y-axis and then place on the x-axis. And so this is from the Waka Kotahi, which is the New Zealand transport agency. And I've added my extra stuff just to make this a little more clear to a US audience. So if you look at the top left corner, transit corridors, that's basically freeways. So that is a super high movement priority and basically zero place. And so that's where you're going to have your highest speeds. But if you look at the top right corner, that is they had a few different categories that I lumped together that had the same speed limits. So that's potentially city hubs. And so these are locations where you have high movement priority, but you also have high place. So that might be like downtown retail corridor, or it could be a retail district in a residential neighborhood. But these are places where you expect to have intermixing of traffic and people using the street as a place. And so those are going to have sort of low to moderate speed limits. And this is, principles-based approach to setting these speed limits. So you are looking at minimizing the risk of fatalities and serious injuries. So then at the bottom right, you see civic spaces, and those are your super high place and super low mobility places. So that might be like a civic plaza or a street that's devoted more to pedestrian activity. It might only allow transit, things like that. So I'll provide an example of how this approach could be applied in Oakland, where I live. So they happen to install some complete streets countermeasures on Telegraph Ave in North Oakland. So the before image at the top, you have a 4-lane road. There's a crosswalk there, and you can see some retail businesses. So for this category of street, you'd have a baseline of 20 miles per hour as your speed limit. So this is, a speed that where most pedestrians or bicyclists are going to survive a crash. But then they installed protected bike lanes and median refuge islands a couple of years ago. And so under the New Zealand approach, you could increase this speed on this corridor to 25 miles per hour. And in their table, they say if this criterion is met, so on-street cycle lane or separated cycling facility provided. So you're providing that separation that makes it more safe for the different types of users to be on the same road. So there's also a movement in place framework for rural roads. And this is a little different. They're less focused on the movement. You can see the stopping places is the full height for movement. So that has a bigger range in speeds. The interregional connectors are maybe what we would have as expressways. So those are almost like freeways, but they're not elevated because they're in a rural area and they don't need that separation. And I'll just show an example of how their framework would be applied on a rural connector. Let me see. So rural connectors are sort of 2-lane highways that have moderate speeds. So the middle image is what I would put it more of their baseline speed of around 50 miles per hour. And that is a road that is sealed with a marked center line and an edge line. So you would consider reducing the speed there if it had a tortuous alignment. So this example is a highway that's going through a mountainous area in the state. And then the bottom one, I'm sorry, that's covered, is you could increase that speed if you added a median barrier. So, the determination for speeds here versus in urban areas is more about preventing the conflicts between cars. And so, a median barrier is going to prevent crossover crashes, which are the highest kinetic energy crashes that you're going to see on these rural roads. So what would this approach mean for California? And I think of it as kind of flipping it on its head. So what we have now is that the speed limit is based on driver behavior. And then if you want to reduce the speed limit, you have to install traffic calming countermeasures to achieve that desired speed. So you have to record that. But this would be moving to a case where the speed limit is set to minimize risk of fatality or serious injury. And so if you have an operational need to have higher speeds on a road, you would need to install safe system countermeasures to justify that. And then if you are not seeing compliance, so they do surveys too, but they do it after the fact. And they see are the drivers complying with the speed limit? And if they're not, then you would look at what the speed management countermeasures are. So it's not gonna articulate this well. So yeah. So one of the things that we got pushback on when proposing this was, it's not objective. How do you make this quantitative? And so, we found some examples of existing movement in place measures for California. So the no-brainer is the functional classification system. So you have interstates are 1 and local streets are 7, and you have all the stuff in between. And then this might be getting wonky for the folks here. There was a recent design information bulletin from Caltrans that was on contextual design guidance for complete streets. And they talked about place types, and they have defined those place types throughout the state. And those are for rural areas, suburban areas, and urban areas. So these are not exactly the place types that we would imagine for speed limit setting, but this is something that folks are thinking about in the state. And those were developed using quantitative methods. So they're based on a curb study that was done by Deborah Salon, I believe, when she was at UC Davis. Yeah. So they simplified the categories, and they've defined that throughout the state. So we're not totally reinventing the wheel. So we've been funded for a second phase. Oh. So this is another not reinventing the wheel thing. There's work at the national level on this, and I have a bunch of other examples that I don't have time to present today. But folks are thinking about how to expand the functional classification system to include context and place. So there was an NCHRP study a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years, several years ago, that looked at this, and they've got context or place on one dimension and roadway on another, and they're talking about speeds. So it's not too revolutionary. So I'm gonna present some of the very, very early work that we're doing on this. So for our classification methodology, so we've been funded by Caltrans to continue this work and try to develop this movement in place framework for the state. And we're not going to reinvent the wheel on functional classification. So we did decide to merge major and minor collectors because I think minor collectors, there are not very many. So to make this digestible by these traditional traffic engineers, we're trying to make it very objective. That's not how they did it in New Zealand. I think they focused on sort of more intuitive planning approach, but we're trying to sort of re-engineer with data that we have available. So we took road segment data and we linked that with EPA Smart Location Database data and Esri Business Analyst point of interest data. And we divided these segments at intersections and then dropped the ones that were less than 10 meters so that we wouldn't get too bogged down in these little details. And so then we separated out urban and rural as defined. It's sort of by the census, but I think maybe it's Caltrans categories. And then we had our variable selection process, and we were looking at interpretability and the correlations, and then we normalized the scales of the variables so that the distributions made sense. And then we had a dimension reduction process, and then we conducted clustering, which led us to the place types. And so for that variable reduction, we ended up with, this is just for the urban, with population density, employment and household entropy, and don't make me explain exactly what that is, but I think it's kind of like jobs housing balance. Distance to the nearest transit stop, walkability index, and the number of retail and restaurant points of interest within 50 feet. So we're trying to capture those businesses that are actually on the street and not end up going around the corners onto those residential streets. And so we were trying to have those not overly correlated. So the walking and the jobs housing balance were the most correlated of what we had there, or actually not correlated. No, those were the most correlated. So from our preliminary clustering results, we used HDV scan. And what we found was that transit accessibility, basically we decided to create a group that didn't even get included in the clusters, and that's really low transit locations. And those are just the lowest place values, because those are going to be like hilly residential areas or sort of more remote areas still within urban. And then HDV scan was used for determining the other 3 clusters, and there's a visual representation of those dimensions. And you can see that for the number of road segments, we have the most in P3, which is like the medium low place, and the fewest in P1, which is the highest place. And I think that's what you would expect. So this is the distribution of those variables for each of the clusters. So on the left, you have the high place cluster values. So I think these are all trends you would expect, that the population density is the highest when the place value is higher. Same with the entropy. Distance to transit is inversely related to place. Walkability is correlated with place, and then a little hard to read the retail and restaurant POIs. So this is just a sneak peek, very not legible on the screen here. I'm sorry about that. Just showing this, we did a lot of trial and error on this because it's really, really tricky doing this quantitatively. And so, trying to match our intuition. So this is the place type without consideration of the movement. But you can see that there is, variability within these regions that we're showing. And that P1, the red, is clustered mostly around the downtown areas where you would expect the high place values. And so I think that's all I'm showing on this one, because our results are not ready for prime time, but that was a little sneak peek. So I just want to talk a little bit about what else is happening in California. So some or all of you may be familiar with AB 645. So that bill was passed, I think, about a year and a half ago. And it authorized speed camera pilots in 6 cities around the state. This last year, don't ask me the bill number, but there was another bill that allowed a pilot in Malibu as well. And that one is a little different because it's focused on the Pacific Coast Highway, where there was a particularly horrific pedestrian crash that happened with an egregious speeder in I think 23. Remembering the safe systems pyramid, which I'm going to show on the next slide again, the speed limit setting, speed limits are in this active measures level. So it's not something that should be happening independently. You need other countermeasures and policies that are going to prop up those speeds. But the speed, having the appropriate speed limits in the first place is really important so that something like speed cameras can actually prevent the egregious speeding. So what else is needed? So, one of the things that was not recommended in the Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force report was use of intelligent speed assistance. And are folks here familiar with that? So that is basically speed limiter technology that's installed in a vehicle. And it uses either GIS data or video to capture speed limit signs and can prevent, in the case of active ISA, it can prevent vehicles from going over the speed limit or some threshold over the speed limit, or in the case of passive, might provide a visual or auditory indicator to the driver. So in the case of active speed assistance, that is more of a latent safety measure. So that's something that doesn't require action from the driver. It's just gonna keep the vehicle at a safe speed. So they've, the most famous US case of that is in New York, where they've been implementing it in the city's fleet of vehicles. If you look at Europe, they are requiring all new cars to include this technology. And most new cars in the US have the capability, they can't force you to use it. So I would argue that a good starting point for the state would be to have this technology in government fleet vehicles. That's sort of like low-hanging fruit. There's a current bill that's been proposed for this legislative session that's on, it's a super speeder law. So this would require drivers, I think, who have more than one serious speeding violation to install the active ISA in their vehicle if they want to keep driving. So that's definitely a good start. And I think, well, with the case of DUI, I think most of those DUI crashes are with the repeat offenders. I suspect that it's the same for speeding. And then there was a bill that passed the legislature last year that would have required passive ISA in all new vehicles beginning maybe 2028 or so. I don't remember exactly. And that was vetoed by the governor. And that bill got watered down quite a bit in the legislature. So it went from active ISA to passive with a 10-mile-per-hour threshold over the speed limit, which is putting you at a not super safe speed. And then just, I think, was like 1 beep. So it would have been a good start. And then the other thing that I think is really important in terms of safe roads, and this is in your built environment environment layer, so lower individual effort and higher efficacy would be road design and aligning design speeds with the target speeds of those roads. Because that's a problem we have everywhere where roads are over-engineered in the name of safety.
Ironic.
Yeah. So that's a rethinking we need to do. So that's all I have, and I wanted to acknowledge some of my collaborators on this work, my team at SafeTREC, and I think all of this research was funded by Caltrans.
Questions for Julie? Certainly. Oh, there we go. Eilish is not shy.
So I had one question about how you're categorizing the causes of the crash, but you're saying they're like speed related. So does this mean that like there was one cause, so just a collision, and also someone was going too fast? Like I was a little confused about that too.
So the when we define something as speed related, there's two variables that we're looking at in the crash data. So one of them is primary crash factor, and the other is other associated factor. So the primary crash factor is sort of like the last thing that triggered that event.
Okay.
And then other associated factor, well, so primary crash factor is when it's speed for the at-fault party. But an other associated factor could be with another party in the crash who did not cause the crash. So like say it was a DUI, but another party was speeding. So that might be an other associated factor that would affect the severity, but the
Okay, and out of maybe total crashes, do you have any idea of like, of the total crashes, how many are speed related?
So I think the first graph I had it about 27%, but I think that's only for the primary crash factor. And when you add in the other associated factor, so I think of that as like where speed affected the likelihood of the crash, and then where speed affected the severity of the crash. And I think of both of those as important, and that's like around 32, 33% when you sum those.
Yeah, thank you.
I may have missed area studies the mobility versus pulse.
So for the international examples, the best cases we have are Sweden, Netherlands, New Zealand. Australia is kind of getting there, and New Zealand is the best example of a country that's more similar to the US in terms of their built environment and culture. So that is something that we felt would be more sort of palatable to the policy frameworks here.
Did you see any contradictions between any of those four places?
I don't think I would say contradictions. There's, somewhat different approaches.
Right.
Other questions?
For the technology one, so I have kind of know there is a few ongoing research at the federal level looking at vehicle technology from like driving under the influence perspective. It's called driver assistant system. So they have this is ongoing. I think it's fairly new. A couple of postdoctors have been working on that. So I wonder if there are any potentials in California. We talk about like speed kind of assistant program for a car. Like there anything could happen like for the driving under the influence. That's another large proportion of fatal and severe crashes.
Well, I think for some of these super speeder laws, they I think some of them also want to implement it for DUI convictions.
Because you kind of a detection like
Yeah.
system. If someone is like kind of have those like impaired status, the car wouldn't start at all, like our
Yeah.
safe belt. Then if you don't take that on,
Right.
then the car wouldn't start at all.
So I think California has a law with requiring ignition interlock for some people who've received DUI conviction. I know that
To breathe
there's,
into something. and you get in the car.
yeah,
Oh.
so there are efforts to develop more passive technology, so where it would like sort of detect your breath from somewhere on the steering column.
Hmm.
Is that already there or we're thinking about it at the moment?
You
Curious.
know, I went to an event where they had a demo of it and I didn't make it outside for the demo, so I don't really know how advanced that is.
I don't know about California, this is probably TMI, but I have a family member who was arrested for a DUI. And for over a year, he had to breathe into a thing to get his car to start. This was in
Oh.
Michigan, so. No names.
Yeah, it was funny, I think the California got additional behavioral safety funds for a while because they hadn't implemented the ignition interlock program. And that seemed weird to me, but I don't know the details on that.
Thank you.
Try.
I have a questions about the Auckland example, because I saw the change after they create a separate infrastructure for the bike.
Yeah.
But in the, like, after a change, I didn't see the crossing lanes is still existing, or they update.
Yeah, I think it's just like where I captured the screenshot there, but I'm pretty sure that crosswalk is still there, yeah.
Did they, like,
And it probably has like a median refuge as well.
yeah, because I see the speed limit is increased compared to before, so.
Yeah,
uh,
theoretically, this is,
okay.
the speed limit is at least 25 there. Because we're stuck with her all the way.
I'll throw a question in. Do you know if the governor said anything about why he vetoed the speed limiter bill?
I'm sure he did, but I do not.
I haven't had a chance to take the time to look it up. I
Yeah.
was curious if you knew, so. I was also very disappointed, and several of my students in the room have heard how disappointed. My take is that was it, I'm never voting for Newsom. That's how upset I was, but yeah.
Yeah, I was disappointed, but my hope is that the next round it'll be a stronger bill and we'll
Maybe,
get through.
yeah. Other questions for Joanne? Go for it.
But they're almost done with the lunch, I would mention that there's some part of your research on AVs and their interactions with pedestrians and bicyclists. I'm just curious to know what specific interactions are AVs failing to acknowledge with while they're interacting with bikes and pedestrians, and what's the concern?
I cannot tell you that off the top of my head. We're really interested in looking at, so in San Francisco, they have the focus on 5 violations that are most associated with serious crashes. So I think that those violations were identified by SFMTA, and then they wanted SFPD to focus on those violations. And so just for understanding AV safety, we were interested in like, how are AVs doing on the focus on 5? And I think the assumption based on, you know, the AV hype would be that they would do better. I saw a Washington Post piece a month or so ago where the author lived in San Francisco and had a particular crosswalk that he would cross daily, and AVs would not yield to him. Or maybe like 7 out of 10 times they would not yield. I mean, I think it's human drivers are not great at yielding at that location.
9 out of 10 times they would yield.
But you know, they had video showing all these examples where he's like, you know, waving and moving in different ways, and they're just zooming by. And so, yeah, I'm really interested in, okay, what are the areas where AVs are better than humans, where humans are not great, and what are the areas where AVs are gonna have trouble, where humans have no problem, like, you know, work zones or maneuvering around emergency vehicles. Those are the sort of anecdotal things I know from reading media from San Francisco. But I'd like to do some research on that.
Somewhat related to that is, do you know how AVs sort of, how their simulation understands vision cones as opposed to human drivers?
That's not my expertise.
That's a great question. I'm curious too. I was trying to go again.
Yeah. So, sorry,
No, I don't. So go for it.
I'm curious, like, what the public perception of, like, speed reductions are. Like, I feel like where I'm from, people would be like, oh, the cops just wanna give us more tickets, like, is it generally received well, or poorly by?
So I guess speaking as myself, not a researcher, my perception is that people want lower speed limits on the street where they live, and they want to be able to drive fast in other people's neighborhoods. So if you're thinking about public acceptance of the, you know, different things I mentioned here, I was interested in hearing about how the ISA technology has been accepted in Europe, and I think drivers there appreciate that the vehicle just, you know, keeps them from speeding. Because I think a lot of people don't want to speed. And so if your vehicle is helping you do that, great. So one of the pushbacks I got when talking about reducing speeds from a practitioner was like, oh, I already spend so much time in traffic, like, I don't want you making my drive even slower. But, you know, the speed in between intersections is not where you're experiencing the most delay. It's due to signal timing, you know, it's intersection control, which is really impacting speed the most.
This may also be personal thought, but a little bit related. I think there's a researcher known as Montarian that I was reading a little earlier this week.
To be here.
Yeah, and she does speak about a little bit about perceived versus objective travel time. And of course, if you're driving in someone else's neighborhood, you're in the vehicle, so you want to go by real quick. But if you're just walking across, trying to cross the street and other driving by, I think the wait time of trying to get to the other side of the street feels like, just let me get by and yeah, let me get through quicker than I want to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing, but I hope there will be public acceptance of reduced speed limits.
Back to towards the beginning, you talked about ways to manage speeds on freeways. And one thing I noticed in Australia, where I just was for a number of weeks, is that they had a lot of like the overhead signage where if there was a slowdown coming up, I can't remember the technical term for it, but I think you know what I'm talking about,
Yeah.
where it's sort of warning you so that you slow down the speeds ahead of time. I don't know that I've ever seen that in California, although I tend to spend a lot of time on bikes and transit, so I may not know. But is that not something that we are testing, or are we not in favor of it, or?
No, I think UC Berkeley was involved in something along the 580 corridor
Okay,
through the
okay,
East Bay.
okay.
And so I was not at all involved, so I'm hesitant to say
Yeah,
too much
yeah.
and get it wrong, but I think they were trying to it was more about identifying appropriate speeds for the different lanes to smooth traffic.
Okay. But it seems like as a way to warn people that like there is something ahead, like it would, that rear end problem, it seems like, I don't know the research in this area that well, but it seems like it would make a pretty big difference on that metric.
Well, I know folks at Treads are looking at, like, in-vehicle or like, smartphone technology that would warn, heavy truck drivers about like work zones ahead, just other things that would, you know, encourage them to slow down in advance of, obstacles, things like that. I just wonder if there's, you know, if there's some like, I to V technology that could, sort of, bypass the driver in some of that.
No, I just wanted to comment along those lines. We do have the signal ahead sign, so we have that idea, and that's the same idea as that you need to slow down because there's gonna be a signal ahead that maybe you can't see, and they don't want you blowing through it, so. I mean, we understand that that's a concept. We have those signs. I don't really know why we would not want to do that.
Ally, were there any good questions online that we should throw out there? Do you want me to take a look at them?
You take a look.
Okay, I can take a look. Well, I think somebody back here is just raising. Okay. Was there somebody over here? Go for it. Sandra.
So you told about the state practitioners' perspective on a few things. What was their perspective on this dynamic speed limits or variable speed limits as part of their solution to calm speeds on the freeways?
You know, we didn't talk specifically about variable speed limits, but I've read or seen recently that that's been a suggestion, like nighttime speed limits that might help with problems with pedestrian fatalities at night.
Is there like any conversation about like preventative measures versus punitive measures and which one people are like preferring, or is it just generally that both should be done?
I think preventive is better, but you know, we sort of have to work within what's available. I think generally talking to the public, they're like, oh, we needed more enforcement, you know, if it's in their neighborhood. But yeah, I think, you know, when you talk about speed cameras in cities, I think a lot of pushback to those is that it's like a revenue generation approach. And when you talk to the folks who are actually implementing the speed cameras, like they would love to not have any violations identified. You know, they want to not make money. They want to spend money to have that because they want to see drivers complying with the speed limit.
So I think we're at time anyway. Can we thank Jillian?